I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, the ongoing storm that's erupted in the Palestinian world over Israel's response to the wanton murder of 2 Israeli police officers on July 14th, just outside the entrance to the Temple Mount. Since the Arab Israelis responsible for the murders somehow obtained their weapons from the Temple Mount, Israel took what seemed to be rather measured and rational steps of installing metal detectors at the entrance of the Temple Mount so that no other firearms could be brought to the Temple Mount and stored there for future attacks on Israelis. The Palestinians and the Jordanians, who have a part in administering the Temple Mount for the Muslim community, became furious. Instead of understanding that the metal detectors were simply a way of installing security measures, the Palestinians and Jordanians accused Israel of trying to take control from them of the Temple Mount. And this metal detector then triggered a series of other Palestinian murders. On Erev Shabbat, July 21st, a week after the murders near the Temple Mount, a 19-year-old Palestinian from the West Bank entered the home of a Jewish family in the community of Halamish and viciously murdered 70-year-old Yosef Solomon and 2 of his children, 46-year-old Chaya and 36-year-old Eldad, while another of his children protected 5 grandchildren upstairs. Then 2 nights later, a 17-year-old Palestinian in Jordan came to the Israeli embassy in Amman ostensibly to install some furniture and used a screwdriver to stab an Israeli guard. In self-defense, the guard managed to shoot and kill the Palestinian, and that enraged Jordan's King Abdullah II, who threatened to cancel the Israeli-Jordanian peace agreement. And in fact, Israel has pulled the entire embassy staff out of Amman, taken them back to Israel, while Jordan demands Israel hand the guard over to them. Israel refuses. What Israel does do, however, is to remove the metal detectors from the entrance to the Temple Mount and plans to replace the detectors with cameras that can detect hidden objects. This, too, has enraged the Palestinian community, which rejects it entirely, and Mahmoud Abbas has called for a freeze in security cooperations with Israel and has said he will break off all dialogue with Israel. Well, thankfully, the situation in Jordan seems to have been dealt with calmly and rationally. And the man in the middle of this firestorm is an Israeli who's made a series of major contributions to the state of Israel in many ways. He's a former head of the Mossad, Israeli intelligence, and he was a former head of the Israeli Security Cabinet. Most importantly, he was instrumental in brokering the Israeli-Jordanian peace agreement. He's an author of an autobiography, Man in the Shadows, and it's an honor for me to have on our JBS phones from Israel, Efraim Halevy. Efraim, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm pleased to be with you this evening.
Efraim, you've done extraordinary work for the State of Israel. Before we begin, I simply want to thank you on behalf of all of the Jewish people, on behalf of American Jewry, for all the years of service you've given to the Jewish people. Thank you, kol hakavod to you, Efraim.
I was only doing my duty.
That's very sweet of you to say. Efraim, as a former head of Mossad, do you think there was any breakdown in Israeli security in Amman that led to the Palestinians stabbing an Israeli guard with a screwdriver?
I think you have a somewhat incomplete series of facts which add up to a narrative concerning the event close to the Israeli embassy.
Please.
According to the most recent narrative coming out both from Israeli sources and Jordanian sources, the event was more of a scuffle than anything else. The guard was in a building close to the embassy, which houses one of the apartments of the embassy staff. And the person who came to the apartment was a carpenter who was coming in to install a piece of furniture which had been ordered in beforehand and which was about to arrive. And he came to the apartment with his father, who is the owner of the apartment. And a dispute arose between the guard who was there, who was either an inhabitant in the apartment, or he was helping somebody else who was the actual resident in the apartment. And arose a disagreement concerning financial matters which were involved in the delivery of this piece of furniture. And tempers became frayed, and the young fellow, I think 16-year-old, had a screwdriver in his hand, and he attacked the guard. And the guard was slightly wounded and responded by firing a few shots, which mortally wounded both a 16-year-old boy and a 17-year-old boy, and one other person who was the owner of the apartment and who by profession is a medical doctor. That is the sum total of all this. And initially the Jordanians did not allow the guard to leave. They wanted him to be handed over for interrogation concerning the event. Israel did not agree to this. The guard was there on a diplomatic passport, and therefore there was a claim for diplomatic immunity. But the embassy wanted to evacuate some of the personnel there initially, and Jordan refused to allow this. And in the end, there was a standoff, and the embassy staff remained ensconced in the building of the embassy, and the embassy building was surrounded by military vehicles and personnel. And that is what happened, and that is where the standoff reached its highest point of tension during this event.
Efraim, the way you describe it, whatever happened between the Palestinian and the guard was not premeditated. Did I understand you correctly? I'm sorry?
It was not premeditated, no. The boy, the 16-year-old, did not come with the prior intention of carrying out a terrorist act. No.
You know, it's
and
interesting.
He had a screwdriver because he was involved
Sure.
in dealing with the furniture.
I understand.
Setting it up and putting in some screws and things like that.
You know, the way the story is reported here to the American Jewish community, it sounded as if this were another event triggered by the incidents at the Temple Mount. It seems to me that was incorrect.
That is totally incorrect. The incident was not triggered by anything even faintly and close to the Temple Mount crisis. And as I said, the altercation between the CIA boy and the guard was a result of disagreements they had on some of the financial aspects.
I see.
This is also the gist of the evidence which the guard gave to the Jordanians, and ultimately they were allowed to interrogate him in the presence of an Israeli diplomat, and the Jordanians accepted this as the version, the correct version of what had actually taken place.
Okay. Very helpful for us here to get the story as it actually happened. Talk to me about your reaction to Israel's decision to put a metal detector at the entrance to the Temple Mount. By the way, Efraim, do you know, were the metal detectors installed at the bottom of the path that leads up to the Temple Mount or at the top of the path?
It was not at the top of the path, it was the bottom of the path.
Bottom of the path.
Yes.
Okay. And the Palestinians were very angry that Israel was installing this security measure.
Right.
What's your reaction to that?
You have to analyze this event from two angles. One was the narrow necessity which arose after the event where two Israeli border policemen were murdered by three young Israeli Arabs on the Temple Mount. And the other is the broader connotation of what this installment of magnetmeters represented. Immediately after the event on the Temple Mount where the two men were killed, the question arose: how was it necessary, and how should Israel proceed in trying to prevent future attacks of this nature? In other words, how to prevent the passage of arms into the Temple Mount. And the powers that be in Israel determined that the only way to do this was to supervise and to carry out careful monitoring of the people who were about to enter Temple Mount in the weeks to come. And we're talking about, in certain cases, many, many thousands of people. How to monitor them and how to carry out some kind of an inspection to determine whether they had their arms with them. And the second aspect of this was that the means to this end would also, in one way or another, be part of the ongoing disagreement, basic disagreement between Israel and the Palestinians as to the status of Temple Mount. And what happened was that this matter was decided by the Prime Minister in a very short session he had with not the full, shall we say, the full presence of all the military and intelligence and security units which are involved in ensuring Israel's overall security, both domestic and external. And the decision was taken to place the magnetometers there as the means of assuring that arms would not be able to pass into the Temple Mount. But at the same time, when this act was carried out and the Palestinians objected, Israel countered by saying, amongst other things, that the erection of the magnetometers was either, for one interpretation, a result of the basic fact that Israel has the overall sovereignty of the Temple Mount, and another adjacent claim or adjacent interpretation of the placement of the magnetometers was that the magnetometers in themselves became a symbol of, a partial symbol of the sovereignty that Israel claims to have over the Temple Mount.
Mm-hmm.
So the magnetometers assumed two lives. One was the life of trying to bring security, and the other second life was to notch up one further notch Israel's claim or Israel's assertion that the ultimate sovereignty on Temple Mount is Israel's.
Mm-hmm.
And this set off a series of reactions which are continuing even as we speak this
Yes.
week.
Efraim, I want to clarify something you're saying.
Yes.
You've explained, I believe, how the Palestinian views. There are two. Israel says we're doing this for a security measure. The Palestinians worry that in some way this is Israel trying to take ultimate control of the Temple Mount. In your mind, did any of Israel's actions to install some kind of security measure, whether it's going to be the metal detectors, which now have been removed, or whether it's going to be special cameras that can see, I don't know, somehow see what's inside somebody's bag or something, I don't know. But from your perspective, is there here a hidden agenda by the Israeli government to in some way wrest control of the Temple Mount from the Palestinians and the Muslim world?
I would not go as far as what you have said.
How far would you go?
All I can say is that as of the very initial stage of this recent conflict, and now more and more in the last 24 hours, senior spokesmen of the Israeli government and others have made a point of raising the issue of sovereignty as a key element in our approach. Ministers like Mr. Tzachi Hanegbi at Israel Katz and others, leading parliamentarians like Avi Dichter, who was a former head of the Israel Security Service and now he's chairman of the Foreign and Defense Committee of the Knesset. He's a member of Knesset and a former minister. In the last 24 hours, I've heard with my own ears a repetitive claim or repetitive statement that Israel is acting, amongst other things and other considerations, as based on its, shall we say, possession of the title of sovereignty in all its forms. And this is something which I believe is an untenable position for a variety of reasons. The issue of sovereignty in Jerusalem as a whole, and but especially certainly in Temple Mount, is a matter which has a furnace of hostility, the like of which we have never seen before.
Mm-hmm. I want to understand where you are philosophically. Ephraim, are you saying that you are against philosophically the idea that you are now hearing with your own ears, where people are talking about the extent of Israeli sovereignty? Or are you upset with it more for strategic reasons, and you believe that all it could do is inflame violence in Israel, on the West Bank, and in some sense, anywhere Israelis are throughout the Arab world?
My answer is a little more, how shall I say, nuanced than the question you have asked.
Okay.
I believe that in order to give a chance to some kind of a lowering of the flames between us and the Muslim world, in order to try and to bring down the intensity of the confrontation between us and the Muslims on the religious level of the incompatibility of the two religions, basically. We have to resort to a methodology not of trying to iron out the differences and reach an ultimate conclusion. We have to seek ways and means of promoting coexistence in one form or another.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And a few years ago, when I was involved in the secret negotiations between Israel and Jordan on the peace treaty, and when the king came up one evening with the idea that the peace treaty should involve a section dealing with Jerusalem and the special role of Jordan in the religious sites in Jerusalem, and obviously with special emphasis on the Temple Mount. This matter, when he came up and talked to me about this, initially I felt I was not competent to even to deal with it in any form, because this was really the very last result of the conflict between us and the other side. But the king made it clear to me that if this element was not in the treaty, mm-hmm. then there would not be a peace treaty. Mm-hmm. And in that form, in that vein, I brought back the message to the late Prime Minister Rabin. To my surprise, Rabin not only did he not object to inserting this element, but he himself, with his own pen and pencil or pen and paper, he drafted the ultimate wording of that section, which is now called Section 8 of what was initially the Washington Declaration and then became the peace treaty. Mm-hmm. Now, the idea was to try and to remove the issue from the immediate field between us and the Palestinians, to enlarge the scope of those who would be involved in the ultimate status of the Temple Mount, and to reach a formula which was not worked out to the end, but a formula which would enable the claims for sovereignty of every one of the components to be watered down to something different than physical control in the simplest sense of the word. And I believed, following in the footsteps of Yitzhak Rabin, of blessed memory, that this was the right way to go. Mm-hmm. The result was that when ultimately the peace treaty came up for approval in the Knesset, after the peace treaty was signed, those voting for the peace treaty were more than 100 members of parliament, which is unprecedented.
Yes.
And therefore, I believe that those who raise the issue of sovereignty now, in conjunction with what happened on Temple Mount, were doing a disservice to the cause of security in its narrow sense of the word. If we had, from the very outset, confined our approach to dealing with the security problem and seeing what can be done in cooperation with the Jordanians, who were granted a special status on Temple Mount, and in conjunction with others who were involved, to reach a resolution of the immediate problem, then we might have been somewhere else than we are today. But this was not what happened. And the result is that, notwithstanding the fact that the immediate crisis in Jordan concerning the guard has been resolved, because the guard was released after giving evidence, but now all the alternatives to the magnetometers, there's a series of various alternatives which are being proposed: photography, thermal photography means, and a variety of other things which I don't think it's necessary to discuss over the telephone at the moment. The religious authorities on Temple Mount, the Muslim religious authorities, the Waqf, are rejecting every possible solution. And just a couple of hours ago, the head of the Palestinian Authority, Abu Mazen, rejected any compromise and any accommodation to the necessity of increased, augmented security arrangements on Temple Mount. And all he says is we have to restore the situation to where it was on the 14th of July, and that is what has to be done, and nothing else will suffice. And the moment I'm talking to you, I see no daylight, no crack in the wall as to how this is going to be resolved as I talk to you at the moment. So the fact of the matter is, this evening, notwithstanding the fact that the magnetometers have been removed, notwithstanding the fact that no new means have yet been installed, nevertheless, the Muslims continue to boycott Temple Mount.
Efraim, it is eye-opening to speak with you. I thank you so much for sharing not only the information, but also your perspective. I'm sorry I don't have an hour with you right now. Maybe at some other time I'll have a chance to speak to you even longer and more in depth. Again, you've done tremendous service to the State of Israel and therefore the Jewish people. And I thank you very, very much, Efraim, for giving us time on JBS.
Okay, good evening, and let's hope for better days.
Absolutely. Thank you, my friend.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
The thoughts of Efraim Halevy, who again was a former head of the Mossad of Israel, and he was instrumental in brokering the initial Israeli-Jordanian peace agreement. And it's so interesting to hear his description of what happened in Jordan, which is so very different than what we all thought happened based on the reports that we read and even communicated to you on JBS. As always, my thanks to our director, Sloan Copeland, JBS's Associate Director, Dara Golub, to editor, John McDevitt, and to the producers of this edition of In the News, Carol Lilienthal and Jan Weiss, and special thanks to Tisha Bader. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.